Washington has suspended a shipment of thousands of bombs to Israel over concerns the country is about to launch a full-scale ground offensive in Rafah. Israel launched a limited operation in the city on Tuesday, seizing the border crossing with Egypt in a bid to choke off supply lines to Hamas.
We continue to have concerns about a potential Rafah operation. We have made that quite clear. We've made it clear with the Israeli government privately, and of course, everyone from the president on down has made that clear publicly.
There's been fierce international criticism towards Israel's plans to move into Rafah to eliminate the Hamas battalions it says are based there. More than 1.4 million Palestinians have sought shelter in the city, moving there on the advice of the Israeli military, who declared it a safe zone. The day before the military moved into Rafah, it ordered around 100,000 Palestinians to evacuate from the east of the city.
احنا اخذنا منها تقريبا بسبب المناشير اللي ارسلتها اليهود او الجيش الاسرائيلي ارسلها علينا، بالاضافه كمان اتصلوا فينا اتصالات على الجوال اخلوا هاي المنطقه بالكامل.
The United Nations says the humanitarian situation in Gaza remains extremely fluid and that staff continue to face a range of challenges. But the Israeli military said one key crossing at Kerem Shalom was reopened on Wednesday and that aid had passed through. One of the major land routes into Gaza, it was closed at the weekend following a Hamas rocket attack. Chinese President Xi Jinping has arrived in Hungary, his third and final stop on his tour of Europe. He was met at the airport by Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orbán and in a speech said China and Hungary are good partners of mutual trust. Shortly after Xi's arrival, Orbán took to X, simply saying, "Welcome to Hungary, President Xi." This year marks the 75th anniversary of China-Hungary ties, and that relationship is expected to get closer. Hungary was the first member of the European Union to join China's Belt and Road Development Programme, seen by many in Europe and China as Beijing's gateway to the European continent. Part of that project will see the construction of a railway line between Budapest and Belgrade, financed mainly by Beijing. But not everyone in Hungary is convinced.
Európában demokráciával, minden hibájával, minden nehézségével együtt. Kínában ez nem egészen így működik. Kína egy kommunista, kapitalista, techno-hibrid birodalom, aminek nem úgy tűnik, hogy jó következményei vagy jó jövője lesz. Nem szeretnénk azt, hogyha Magyarországra exportálnák ezeket az elképzeléseket, amiket Kínában gyakorolnak.
Brussels, meanwhile, is advocating for protectionist measures to limit China's economic ambitions in Europe. And the European Commission has opened investigations into Chinese subsidies to electric vehicles and solar panels, accusing them of distorting competition. Riot police in the Netherlands have broken up a pro-Palestine protest at the University of Amsterdam. Protesters began building barricades made of desks, fences and wooden pallets on Tuesday following news reports of an Israeli military operation in Rafah. Students had blocked access to several campus buildings to put pressure on the university to sever all ties with Israel. They say the Israeli institutions the university works with profit from the oppression of Palestinians.
For the first time ever, sanctioning Russian gas is on the EU's agenda. But the scope of the measures will be limited. EU countries will continue to be able to buy Russian LNG, but will not be able to re-export it after transforming it. After coal and oil, gas was the next big move for the EU to sanction. The EU has so far been hesitant to touch gas, as it risks harming the EU's economy. This expert explains how the EU waited for the right conditions.
with the storage basically at a very safe place and with new suppliers and new contracts, the EU feels like it can start sanctioning Russian gas. I think the rationale behind all the sanctions so far has been we want to make damage to Russia more than to ourselves. And that's why natural gas was never sanctioned before.
The EU has reduced its dependency from Russian pipeline gas from 40% in 2021 to 8% in 2023. According to EU data, LNG's imports have increased in recent years, especially in countries like Belgium and Spain. Re-exporting, also known as transshipment, remains relevant.
Russia makes about 8 to 9 billion a year in LNG exports to the EU. I think in 2023 it was 8 billion euros. And transshipment is still a quite considerable chunk of that. It's 10 to 15% of overall exports of the Yamal LNG terminal. So it has the potential to affect these companies.
EU ambassadors are having a first discussion on what would be the 14th package of sanctions against Russia this Wednesday. The goal is to approve it before Hungary takes over the Council presidency next July, as Budapest has previously presented opposition to previous packages.
It's a daily occurrence. For over 1 year now, rescue services have been disembarking dozens of migrants in the Canary Islands who are trying to reach European soil from Africa. It's a journey increasingly undertaken by minors as young as 15, travelling alone. Babacar arrived in the Canary Islands from Senegal. Many of his fellow travellers didn't make it to the coast.
Salimos del Senegal, el viaje está un poco malo, ¿sabes? Y hay mucha gente que murió.
Along with other boys, Babacar has tried to overcome his trauma in this reception centre in Tenerife, where they learn the language and hope to be able to work once they come of age.
Este es uno de los tantos centros que se han habilitado aquí en Canarias para atender a los menores no acompañados. Hasta 5.000 se encuentran ahora bajo la tutela del Gobierno de Canarias.
Authorities have had to double the number of reception centres to deal with the arrival of minors. Half of them will be transferred to the mainland, but the southern border is looking to Europe for solutions.
Planteamos en algún momento que se pusiera en marcha un programa de acogimiento familiar a nivel de la Unión Europea para que diéramos una respuesta en la que se impliquen los Estados.
The new migration pact oversees the distribution of migrants to other EU countries, but Spanish National Conservative Party Vox opposes the measure and is calling for the total closure of borders.
Para Vox es fundamental la soberanía de los Estados, y si los Estados quieren tener unas fronteras seguras, es necesario bloquear esas fronteras. Podemos perfectamente recurrir a nuestras Fuerzas Armadas para, por ejemplo, plantear un bloqueo naval.
The coalition Canaria candidate is calling for action to tackle the root causes of illegal immigration and for the islands to become a hub for development cooperation.
Que se trata en el origen y que se utilice regiones como Canarias no solo como una plataforma para contener el fenómeno migratorio y darles recursos para gestionar ese problema, sino que sea una plataforma también para ayudar al desarrollo.
The European Migration Pact was approved just a few months before the current European Parliament dissolves, but its implementation will depend on the outcome of June's EU elections. Meanwhile, the southern border expects to break records this year, with the arrival of 70,000 migrants on the Canary Island coasts.
Swathes of protesters took to Dublin as part of an anti-immigration march in Ireland's capital. Chants of "Get them out," as well as criticism of opposition political parties, could be heard over the marching demonstrators, who were carrying placards that stated "Irish Lives Matter" and "Economic migrants are not refugees." The protesters walked from the Garden of Remembrance to O'Connell Street and were accompanied by the police. According to local media reports, the protest was organised by a local town which has been gripped by intense protests against asylum seeker accommodation centres in recent weeks. Immigration is an increasingly hot topic in Ireland, with almost 20,000 asylum seeker cases in the backlog. The crisis is compounded by the UK firming up its tough stance against new arrivals, who are now increasingly heading north.
A vessel from the Scandinavian NGO Ship to Gaza has arrived at the Swedish port of Malmö amid protests against Israel's participation in the Eurovision Song Contest. Several hundred people were at port to see the ship arrive from Norway. Stopping in several European ports, the NGO aims to raise awareness of the humanitarian situation in Gaza. Activists say they will also try to break Israel's sea blockade of the Gaza coast. The Olympic flame has arrived in the southern French city of Marseille aboard the 19th century sailing ship the Belém. French Olympic swimmer Florent Manodou became the first torch carrier in France after the flame arrived from Greece. The ship sailed into Marseille's Old Port accompanied by the French national anthem and an Air Force flyover. The 2024 Summer Olympics start in Paris on July the 26th.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, ignition, and liftoff. Go Falcon, go Starlink.
SpaceX has launched 20 Starlink communications satellites into orbit aboard a Falcon 9 rocket. The rocket took off from the Vandenberg Space Force Base in California. The Falcon 9's first stage returned to Earth 8 minutes after launch, touching down on a drone ship in the Pacific Ocean.
Stage number,